بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن تمسك بسنته. أما بعد. Before we get started with our class, we want to make a brief revision of what we took in the first two classes, or at least the last class, which was the second session. We spoke about the author's categorization of Al-Khabar. Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala began his book speaking about Al-Khabar. And we explained what this term Al-Khabar means. We also mentioned a few other synonymous terms such as Al-Athar and such as al-hadith. So we have Khabar, we have Hadith, and we have Athar. And we explained some of the differences between those terms, or some of the similarities or consistencies between those terms, when they are and when they aren't synonymous. The author explained how the Khabar will either have a countless amount of chains, a countless amounts of isnads or tariqs, or it will have a limited or counted amount of isnads. Okay? The first is called, according to the author, al-mutawatir. We explained what the term al-mutawatir meant, linguistically and technically, according to the Arabic language and according to the scholars of al-hadith, or the scholars of Usul-Fikr, or a combination and a mixture of both. We previously shed some light upon that, on how during the time of Hafidh ibn Hajar rahimahullah, which was the 9th century, and before the 9th century and after the 9th century, there were many things that were taking place among the Muslim Ummah, and some of the sciences began to overlap and intercross, and there were some alien concepts and some alien ideas that crept into the science of al-hadith, because the concept or the idea of a khabar and what it proves, this type of knowledge, that type of knowledge, so on and so forth, is not necessarily from the original concepts of the people of hadith. Khair, inshallah, we won't spend too much time on that. Then we mentioned how the author categorized the khabar into the mutawatir, mashhur, aziz, and gharib, and al-gharib. So we explained what tawatur was and the conditions and the descriptions of it, and we gave some examples. Now let's get to which the author says, وَالثَّانِي الْمَشْهُورِ وَهُوَ الْمُصْطَفِيهُ عَلَى رَأْيٍ. He says the second type of khabar is the khabar, he says, أو مع حصر بما فوق الاثنين. He says more than two. More than two. So there could be 3 people in the chain, 4 or 5, as long as it does not reach the level of tawatur. And we explained that there is no definite limit or definition when when a khabar is mutawatir and when it isn't. How many people are there? 10, 20, 30, 50, 100, 70, 300? We don't necessarily have that. Alright? And we also explained that what's meant by this numberization is the tabaqa of the isnad, the level. So therefore, to make an example, we have a hadith, and the person who said this hadith, first and foremost, is, we say what? An-Nabi. An-Nabi, sorry. Alayhi salatu wasalam. Sallahu alayhi wasallam. Who reports from the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam? Of course, the Sahaba. So this is the, what we'll call this what? Tabaqatu Sahaba. Now, there are other people who report from the Prophet ﷺ besides the Sahaba, but for now, this one we'll mention. The asl that we're talking about, a hadith is muttasil, or mawsul, as we've explained in the Bayqaniya classes. So, how many companions reported from the Prophet ﷺ? Let's say 4. Arba'a. 4 companions. Then we have, what's next? Tabaqat Tabi'een. Tabaqat Tabi'een. And let's say among the Tabi'een there are 10. And then we have Tabaqatu Atba' At-Tabi'een. Even though this could be another tabaqah of Tabi'een too, because the Tabi'een reported from each other. just like Sahaba reported from each other. But to keep things simple, we have how many tabaqat? Sahaba, Tabi'een, Atba' Tabi'een, and then comes a book. Or even sometime in the actual after the Tabi'een, such as Malik. Alright, well let's say it's a book here. Between the author of this book, we'll say hypothetically is Imam al-Bukhari or Imam Ahmad Hamim, the abbreviation. And between the Prophet ﷺ are three people, three intermediaries, whether they're men or women. You understand? 1, 2, 3. Once the hadith reaches a book, then it has a different ruling. So, 4 tabi'een, 10 sahaba, and let's say, for example, 7 atba' tabi'een. Is this khabar called mutawatir? We say that we don't have a definite number, but we haven't come across any ulama, and Allah surely knows best, that have said that there can be just 4 people in the isnad, 10 people, 7 people for it to be mutawatir. They say it has to be a higher number. 12, 15, whatever the case may be. 30, 20, 50. So, how many is this? This is 4. فوق الاثنين. He said. Hafidh ibn Hajar, he says, بما فوق الاثنين. بما فوق الاثنين. 4 is above 2. 10 is above 2. 7 is above 2. But it hasn't reached the level of mutawatir. So this type of hadith, or this type of chain, according to the author, is called hadithun mashhur. Hadithun mashhur. So we say today's terminology is al-hadith al-mashhur. And we've explained in the Bayquniya classes what the word mashhur linguistically means. It linguistically means a hadith which is famous. A hadith which is popular. The word is called mashhur. Mashhur. Which is a very common Arab name. A lot of people, they name their sons Mashhur. Alright? Hadith mashhur has 2 types of meanings. We have a technical meaning, and then we have a linguistical or lexical meaning. They aren't the same. Of course, one is based off of another, or the first. Alright? And there's some relation between the two, but they are not the same. So, we say that the hadith is called what? The first hadith is al-mutawatir. We've explained that. Moving on, we have that which is called al-hadith. We said al-hadith al-mashhur. In the first video, I realized I was writing really fast, and my handwriting is already sloppy. So when I write faster, it's even sloppier. So we just want to take our time just a little bit, and not to make any extra or unneeded confusion upon the student. Alright? I've never had good handwriting before I learned Arabic or English or whatever. Al-hadith al-mashhur. Now, we have 2 meanings of hadith mashhur. First is lughatan, and the second one is istilahan. Linguistically and technically. Among the technical meaning, there are different meanings, further branches of its meaning and of its depiction. Lughatan, hadith al-mashhur. Clear. Al-khabar al-mashhur. It doesn't need to be explained. It's famous, it's popular. Linguistical. Then istilahan. We have the mashhur hadith according to what? First and foremost, we say ahl al-hadith. Then we have al-fuqaha. Then we have ahl al-usul. Then we have, for example, we say ahl al-tafsir or al-mufassirin, etc. In other words, a hadith which is mashhur could be authentic and it could be weak. There is no binding condition that the hadith mashhur is authentic. There's no binding condition that is weak. An author is going to shed some light upon that bi-idhnillahi subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whereas the hadith mashhur, according to the author, is from those ahadith which he called ahad. Hadith al-ahad. Alright, the hadith which is ahad, or khabar al-ahad. Khairan inshallah. So that is hadith mashhur. Everybody clear on that? The author then says, وَهُوَ الْمُسْتَفِيضُ عَلَى رَأْيٍ. And this word mashhur is also called al-mustafid according to some people of knowledge. Al-Mustafid. 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 Al-Mustafid comes from the word father, which means to pour out, to rain down on something. In other words, some ulama, they make a difference between mashhur and between mustafid. And they say that al-mashhur hadith or the mustafid hadith is a hadith that in every single tabaqah there is that number of narrators that are above 2. And the mashhur is the one in which only has 1 or 2 tabaqat. We don't want to spend too much time upon that. Whereas the author mentioned that as a sidebar, as they say, ala ra'yin. Alright, we don't want to spend too much time on that. The author, what's important is that we understand the metin. Is that there's some ulama who make a difference between mustafid and mashhur. Alright, an example of this in the science of Usul-Fikr is fard and wajib. Are they the same? Are they synonymous? Or are they different? Some scholars say they mean the same thing. And other ulama say that fard has a stronger meaning, etc. Khairan, inshallah. Moving on. The author he then says, وَالثَّالِثُ الْعَزِيزُ وَلَيْسَ شَرْطًا لِلصَّحِيحِ خِلَافًا لِمَنْ زَعَمَهُ. The third type of khabar is called al-khabar al-aziz or al-hadith al-aziz. The word aziz, we know, has several meanings linguistically. We say al-khabar al-aziz. The word aziz has 2 basic linguistical meanings, coming from the verb azza, then ya'izzu or ya'uzzu. The word azza firstly means nadara, something that's rare, something that's sacred, something that's valuably cherished because it isn't too popular. There aren't too many out there. And the second meaning, yani qawiya washtadda, for something to be strong. Okay? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name is Al-Aziz. Inna Allah qawiyyun aziz. Allah is powerful and mighty, subhanahu wa ta'ala. Khairan, inshallah. So the hadith aziz, according to what the author says, aw bihima. Yani, he says, aw bihima. In other words, 2 narrators في طبقة من طبقات السند. Let's go back to our tabaqat now. First tabaqa is Al-Nabi Al-Kareem alayhi salatu wasalam. Then we have As-Sahaba Al-Kiram radiyallahu anhum, Tabi'een, etc. طيب. So, how many Sahaba reported this hadith from the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Let's say just 2. Only 2. Not 3, just 2. Anas and let's say Abu Musa Ash'ari radiyallahu anhuma. 2 Sahaba. The tabaqa of the Tabi'een, we only have 2. Or let's say it doesn't even have to go that deep. It could be 4 of them. Or 5 of them. Al-Muhim is that in one tabaqa there is what? There is at least, or there is no less than 2 narrators. There are no less than what? 2. It could be 2 in every tabaqa, or it could be 2 in one and 3 in the other, etc. But in one tabaqa, there are no less than 2. That is what we call, according to the author, al-hadith al-aziz. He then says, وَلَيْسَ شَرْطًا لِلصَّحِيحِ خِلَافًا لِمَنْ زَعَمَهُ. He says in this concept of aziz hadith is not a prerequisite or condition for an authentic hadith. The hadith that is authentic does not have to have at least 2 men or 2 women, yani 2 reporters in its tabaqa, in its level, or in its isnad. He says, nah, that's not correct. So the author here is stating his opinion, and he's also refuting and rejecting and debunking another opinion. An opinion of someone who says that there is no hadith sahih unless there are at least 2 people in each part of the chain. He says, no, that's wrong. That's incorrect. And that opinion was taken by some of the people who belong to the Mu'tazila, the sect. Alright, those people who call themselves Muslims, called Al-Mu'tazila. And it's well known in the Islamic history. Alright, towards the, let's say maybe the 3rd century of Islam, came about a group who had strayed from the Sunnah, and they had deviated, and they had turned away from the Kitab and the Sunnah, and they went towards what they thought, or what they called al-aql, a human intellect, or human reasoning, or rational, or rationalists, some of them call them. And they built an aqidah upon several different bid'ah, several different innovations, and going against the Kitab and the Sunnah. They had like a mixture of what they considered to be aql, and which was aql fasid. It was foul human intellect. It wasn't the correct human intellect, or whether they were affected by the Greeks, ancient Greeks, the Romans, the Indians, the Egyptians, the Persians, all right, the polytheists, the fire worshippers, people who dealt with astrology, people who dealt with different types of philosophy, kalam, ilm kalam, these radical things, challenging everything, the mind controls everything, etc., etc. We're not here, this is not a lesson in Aqidah, all right? However, it's important to understand history. So these Mu'tazila people, they had many things wrong with them, and from the principles of their terrible Aqidah was that they rejected the sifat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They rejected Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's attributes. Also, they declared that there was no qadr. There was no pre-decree. Also, from their innovations, they made takfir upon Muslims who made major sins. They said if a Muslim makes a major sin and he dies, he's no longer a Muslim. He's a kafir in thereafter. In the worldly life, we don't make takfir on him, but when he dies, he's a kafir. Also, from the things in which they strayed from the Sunnah, was that they revolted against sinful Muslim leaders. And they said any Muslim leader who's sinful, we now revolt against him, so on and so forth, etc. What's important, the summary is that the Mu'tazila people were a group of quote-unquote thinkers, and many of them were thinkers. And that doesn't deny the fact that many of them had a great deal of intelligence. But as Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah said about them and others, he said what? They were given utu uqulan wa ma utu fuhuma. He says they were given brains, but they weren't given understanding. Wa utu zaka'an wa ma utu zaka'an. He says, and they've been given intelligence, but they haven't been given purity. Alright, so just because you're smart doesn't mean that you're guided. Just because a person is intelligent doesn't mean that he's upon the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Now, if a person is upon the sunnah, and he has intelligence, nurun ala nur, it's light upon light, that's even better. Khayr, inshallah, we don't want to spend too much time upon that. And the reason why I said that is because some people who think that it's okay to be stupid and dumb, as long as you're upon the, I'm upon the way, and I have no intellect. La, that's not okay. If you don't have brains, then keep silent. Alright? And people think that there's no intelligence in Islam, there's no intelligence in the Sunnah. La, abadan, that's not true. Tayyib. So this Mu'tazila group, they had control of certain Islamic positions, whether with the courts, alright, the education, the schools. Some of them had direct contact towards the leaders. Alright, some of them became the leaders of the Muslims. Okay, and they forced their aqidah upon others. So, when they had political power, they began to write books and author books, and they began to talk about things. So these ideas, they crept out and they seeped into the books of the people of knowledge. That's why Ibn Hajar says, خِلَافًا لِمَنْ زَعَمَهُ. And the ironic thing is, and this is not addressed to Ibn Hajar alone, but anybody, or it's not even addressed to him. Who am I to address Ibn Hajar, Al-Asqalani rahimahullah? But the general concept is that you find people who, whether they are affected by the Ash'ari Aqidah, or whether they are Ash'ari, we're not saying that Hafidh ibn Hajar is Ash'ari, but there lies no doubt there were things in which he was affected by, and others among that time. You find them refuting the Mu'tazila, and talking about the Mu'tazila, and they're astray, and they're misled. But the Ash'ari people, they based their Aqidah off of the Mu'tazila Aqidah, and they refined it, okay, and they synthesized it a little bit, and they were closer to the Sunnah in many aspects that the Mu'tazila were far from the Sunnah. They were closer to the creed of Ahl-Sunnah in many things which the Mu'tazila were. However, they still had innovations with them, and they still were astray, especially when it comes to Al-Iman, especially when it comes to Al-Qadr, and especially when it comes to the Sifat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Alright? As I said, it's not a lesson on Aqidah, but it's important to understand this when you're reading these books. So whenever you find someone, an author who's Ash'ari, or was affected by the Ash'ari Aqidah, or who had some teaching and education in the Ash'ari school, you find them talking about the Mu'tazila. And it's ironic because the same proofs and evidences that they use against the Mu'tazila, Ahlul Sunnah, Ahlul Hadith, they're using against the Ash'ari. This is what Allah said, and there's no similarity, there's no comparison between Allah and His creation. Your mind says something, but the Hadith says another thing, etc. Khayr, inshallah, moving on. The author then says, وَالرَّابِعُ الْغَرِيبُ. He says the fourth type of khabar with regards to how it comes to us is called al-gharib. He says, وَلَيْسَ, he says here, أَوْ بِوَاحِدٍ. In other words, al-hadith gharib, al-hadith, al-gharib is a hadith which is called fard. Linguistically means fard. And a fard, someone who's single, wahid. Someone who's alone. That's what the word linguistically means. As for the technical meaning of hadith gharib, then it is the hadith that has only one person in its isnad. In other words, we have the different tabaqat. The first tabaqa is who? An-Nabi al-Kareem, alayhi salatu wassalam. Sahih? Sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Sahaba al-Kiram, radiyallahu anhum. Then we have at-Tabi'een. Then we have atba' at-Tabi'een. Mathalan, for example. How many Sahaba? 4. How many Tabi'een? 1. How many atba' at-Tabi'een? 20. Mathalan. Now, there's difference of opinion on what type of hadith gharib this is called. But let's go back all the way to the asl. And let's say that this hadith here only has one. It's gharib, it's fard. Only one person at each level of the chain. The Prophet ﷺ, of course, is one, alayhi salam. Sahaba are many, etc. This is a brief explanation of what hadith gharib is, what's meant by hadithun gharib. Is hadith gharib da'if? Is it weak? Is it authentic? That's going to come later on. What's important is that we understand we're not tasawwur. Alright, we actually conceptualize what the author is talking about. And we spoke so many times before the crucial importance for the student of hadith and the student of knowledge to conceptualize, to understand. As the people of knowledge say, al-hukmu ala shay far'un an tasawwuri. To make a ruling on something comes from conceptualizing that thing. You cannot declare something right or wrong until you do what? Conceptualize it. And we've said this so many times before. Many people, they run with something and they refute it and they reject or they accept it. And they themselves don't even know what's being said. You don't even know what you're talking about. How can you say it's right or it's wrong? Let alone for someone else, etc. Right. The author, he then says, وَكُلُّهَا سِوَى الْأَوَّلِ أَحَادٍ. وَكُلُّهَا سِوَى الْأَوَّلِ أَحَادٍ. He says all these types of khabar, besides the first, which the first is al-mutawatir, they are called what? Ahad. They are called what? Ahad. He says, so that is the proper terminology for hadith which is not mutawatir. Regardless whether it's 20 people, 5 people, 1 person, whether it's weak, whether it's authentic, whether it is whatever the case may be, if it's not mutawatir, then the author said it is called what? Ahad. Hadith ahad. Khabar ahad. He then says, وَفِيهَا الْمَقْبُولُ وَالْمَرْدُودُ. Among ahadith ahad is what? Al-maqbul. That which is acceptable. And branching off from the acceptable hadith, what the author is going to mention, we have as-sahih, al-hasan, as-sahih li-ghayrihi, for example. Al-hasan li-ghayrihi, for example. These are all considered maqbul. And then we have what? He says, al-mardud, a hadith which is rejected, which is not accepted, is unacceptable. Pertaining to what? Several different types of hadith which are mardud. Is it extremely weak? Is it fabricated? We have mathalan al-mawdu'. Alright, we said what? Al-mawdu'. Al-da'if. Alright, we have mathalan al-mursal. Al-munqati. Mathalan. Alright, etc. A hadith which is totally baseless. has no isnad, it's totally made up, regardless of its level of weakness, regardless of its reason behind the reason behind its weakness, it is called mardud. It is rejected. Everybody clear on this? Everybody understand what the author is saying to us? He then says, لتوقف الاستدلال بها على البحث عن أحوال رواتها دون الأول. Why do we have a hadith ahad which are divided into these two categories? One is maqbool and one is mardud. He says لتوقف الاستدلال. He says because you have to look and search and direct yourself to the isnads of these ahadith. In other words, the hadith mutawatir has so many chains, so many people in the chains, there's no need to look, according to the author. And what's meant by not looking is not looking at the level of precision of those narrators. As for if some of them are liars, then no. Just because a large number of people report something doesn't mean that it's authentic, because they could lie. And we have clearly seen in history how thousands of people can come together and conjure a lie. Or how some people can see something or experience something, but it didn't actually happen like this and like that. They add things to it, they put things to it, it becomes a lie. And they spread it and throw it down your face so much in propaganda, in the news, in the radio, in books, that it becomes an irrefutable historical reality that this happened during this time to these people in this country, so on and so forth. And it's false. It's a lie. So what's meant here by the looking towards the isnad is the dabt, the precision. As for adala, religious equity and uprightness, then it must be investigated. Now, we don't want to go too far off, and this is just an intermediate level. We don't want to go too deep into the rabbit hole and cause any more confusion. However, all of these concepts support the argument of those who go against this concept of mutawatir. They go against it, and they say it's not precise. Who is to determine who and who wasn't trustworthy, a liar, a Muslim, of age, so on and so forth. Khair, inshallah. Al-Muhim, the author, he says, لتوقف الاستدلال بها على البحث عن أحوال رواتها دون الأول. يعني, he says دون الأول, not the first. The first type, mutawatir, we don't have to search about those men or those women. As for mashhur, as for aziz, as for gharib, then we have to investigate the levels of their isnads. The author, he then says, وقد يقع فيها ما يفيد العلم النظري بالقرائن على المختار. He says, and perhaps among these ahadith, which are called ahad, alright, we have ahadith ahad, hadith which is called what? Ahad. We just explained that in detail. Among ahadith ahad, and there are how many, according to the author? The first one is called what? Mashhur. Then we have aziz. Then we have gharib. Clear? Among these three types is that which he says قد يفيد العلم النظري على المختار. There are among these hadith which could give us that which is called al-ilmu al-nadhari. We clearly explained that the first type, mutawatir, gives us that which is called al-ilmu al-yaqini, according to the author. Conclusive knowledge, certainty, there's no doubt there's a country called Japan. No doubt about it. The second type, ahad, he says, al-ilmu al-nadhari. In other words, it's a type of knowledge that has to be based off of investigation. It's not a knowledge that you hear and you automatically know what's authentic and sound, and you cannot go against it. This is a knowledge, he says, nadhari. You have to look. Is there a place in Japan called Okinawa, for example? I know about Tokyo, but what about Okinawa? Is it an island? Is it a city? Is it a town? How long has it been there? Was it always called that name? You have to go into a dictionary, to an atlas. You go and Google it, Wikipedia, ask this person, so on and so forth. You have to investigate it. You have to look into it. And from that investigation, or the people who tell you about it, this man came there from Okinawa, he came, this person was in World War II, he fought there, so on and so forth. Alright? Then you start to see these different people, they tell you different things. but it's not of the number which is conclusive knowledge. It's ilm nadari. Then you say, you know what? There's no doubt that there's a place in Japan called Okinawa. Without a doubt, there is. Because these people, they've told me, they're not liars. They have precise memory, so on and so forth. Well, there's one person. My grandfather told me. My grandfather was in World War II. He fought in the Pacific. He was there. My grandfather isn't a liar. My grandfather is a Muslim, so on and so forth. That could give you knowledge. Okay, my grandfather, he doesn't lie. He knows what he's talking about. He's not senile. He was there. He showed me pictures, so on and so forth. Or it could be 2 people who told you. Or 3 people, or 4 people, or 5 or 6 or 7. But it doesn't reach the level of what? Mutawatir. Everybody clear on this? So the author says that these ahadith, which are called ahad, mashhur, aziz, gharib, they could be authentic, they could be weak. Clear? Why is that? Because you have to investigate the isnads. Once we find out and we investigate, do we get knowledge from these type of hadith? Do we get ilm? He says yes. Perhaps, sometimes, with the qara'in. He says there has to be, وقد يقع فيها. He says وقد يفيد العلم النظري على المختار. Or وقد يقع فيها ما يفيد العلم النظري على المختار. He says that perhaps we can get something which is called ilm nadri. We'll just explain what ilm nadri is. He says what? Bil qara'ini ala al-mukhtar. He says, but there has to be context clues. There has to be that which is called what? Qara'in, which is the plural of the word qarina, which sometimes is translated to mean as a context clue or a proof, etc. There has to be something special about khabar ahad, according to the author, which allows us to have, quote unquote, ilm. The first qarina that the author mentioned in the explanation of it is called, or for example, that the hadith is in, for example, according to the author, the hadith is in Bukhari and Muslim. According to Hafid bin Hajar, if the hadith is in Bukhari and Muslim, then it gives us ilm nadri. It's totally authentic, no doubt about it. But that knowledge had to come from investigation. Or the hadith could be with a chains of well-known imams, famous imams who are righteous and pious, who were genius memorizers, etc. Alright? It can have many different turuq, etc. What's important here is that this is the author's opinion with regards to what does khabar ahad give us. Now we said before that this was not originally from the understanding and the methodology of the people of hadith. They didn't deal with stuff like this originally. What does a hadith prove? Does it give us knowledge? Does it only give us dhann? So on and so forth. He didn't say that. Although the ulama of a hadith in the past, they didn't talk like that. They didn't use those words, those terms. Rather, this is a proof of what we've said, of how the different foreign ideologies and concepts crept into the Islamic sciences. Usul-Fikr, and also in al-hadith, or mustalah al-hadith. And that is because of the Mu'tazila, without a doubt. People who came, and unfortunately, they forced their will upon the other scholars. They forced their will. This is what the hadith has to be. And if not, then it doesn't give us knowledge. It doesn't give us ilm, and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, because of their political control, political power and influence, and that's life. Anytime there is an ideology that has money behind it, and has muscle behind it, those two things, muscle and money, and there is a type of truth to it. Not absolutely, but it's something that's true about it. And has a flair and a feather to it, it's going to spread. And an ideology can spread without money or muscle. But when it does have those two things behind it, then it's going to be institutionalized. It's going to be forced. It's going to be forced. I don't want to believe in this. I don't think that's right, but the government institutionalizes it. Now you must. I don't want to send my children to school, for example. I want to homeschool them, just for example. But now in the state in which you live, you must send your children to school. You have to. And if you don't, you're fined. And if you're fined twice, then you are, what? You go to jail, alright? Or in some countries in which there's communism, a certain amount of children that you can or cannot have. I want to have as many children as possible. But now anybody found with 2 children has to pay this tax. Anyone found with 3 children gets locked up. And so now the concept of controlling the children is institutionalized now. So now it's spread. And they write books on it. These books are no longer allowed to be sold in the store. The books you talk about, this must be sold in the store. And anyone who dares to speak out against it is going to be physically attacked. Is going to be violently tortured. He may be put to death. He may be put in jail. He may have restrictions, etc. Now the ideology is khalas. No one's going to go against it anymore. And we have a scholar or two, an intelligent person or two, a good speaker or two who talk about it, who deem it, and they make it seem fair, and so on and so forth. They bring doubts. They bring different ambiguities, so on and so forth. And now it becomes acceptable. 10 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later, 100 years later. Because of the strength behind it, because of the different doubts, and because of the weakness and the inferiority and the fear of some people who go against their ideology, they have to go hide now. They have to keep silent now. They can't be public and open anymore. So these ideas now, they are accepted realities. And this is in any aspect of life. Islam or other than Islam. And this is what happened to the Muslims. The Mu'tazila, they got power, they got political influence, and they spread their ideas and they forced their will upon other ulama. By the pen or by the sword. So therefore, in the Islamic Sharia, before we stop in this session, we'll give a benefit which is called Maratib al-Idrak. Maratib al-Idrak, which is called levels of, let's say, comprehension or understanding or belief or whatever the case may be. The first level is that which is called, let's say, al-ilm. Second level is that which is called, for example, al-dhann. Al-dhann. What does the word dhann mean? It can be translated to mean more than one thing, but we'll leave it in Arabic. Number 3, we say ash-shak. And number 4, we would say al-wahm. First level is, translated in English, knowledge, certainty. There's no doubt about it. I'm 100% sure. Second level of knowledge, a person will say, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm almost sure. I'm pretty much sure. Yeah, that's it. But can he say 101% there's no doubt about it? Not necessarily. Thirdly is doubt. Istiwa tarafain. I'm not sure. I can't say no, I can't say yes. He's in the middle. And fourthly is al-wahm, in which a person says yes, it's A, but in reality it's actually B. He's totally confused. He has ilm, yaqeen, on something that's wrong. Yeah, that's it. It's letter A. But it's not letter A. In actuality, it's letter B. The first one he says it's letter A, 100%. I'm absolutely sure. He said, you willing to bet money on that? He says, I'm willing to bet money on that. Just an example, not saying gambling is permissible. But he said, I'm willing to put everything on the table. This is it. Trust me, this is it. Secondly is dhann. He's not willing to put money on the table. But he knows that it's right. I'm sure about it, but I'm not going to do that. Thirdly is a shak. I don't know. And fourthly, it's this, but in actuality, or in reality, it's really that. These are called maratib al-idrak. It's a very important concept in Islam, other than hadith science. We don't want to spend too much time on this. Now, some of these ulama, they came and they began to say that a hadith is going to give us one of these two things, either ilm or dhann. And what's meant by ilm is al-yaqeen. And what's meant by dhann, they say, is, we say what? Adam al-yaqeen. And some of these people, they begin to say that if a hadith does not give ilm, we cannot take it fi masail. Fi masail. There's different ways of writing it. Fi masail usul al-din. And what's meant by usul al-din, according to these people, quote unquote, is al-i'tiqad, or al-ilahiyat, concepts of belief or theology, whatever you want to call it. Aqidah, tawheed, iman. The hadith that you take you can only take ilm. So if you have a hadith that affirms an attribute to Allah, but it's not mutawatir to say, we can't accept it. We reject it. We don't believe in this attribute. If there's a hadith that talks about punishment in the grave, that talks about seeing Allah in the hereafter, that talks about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's love of his slave, hatred of a slave, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's nuzul subhanahu wa ta'ala, etc., they say that if it does not come from a mutawatir route, then we do not accept it. Anything that's not mutawatir only gives dhann. And we can take a hadith that's ahad, whether it's mashhur, whether it's aziz, whether it's gharib, if it is in what? Fi furu' ad-din. And what's meant by furu' ad-din? Al-masail al-amaliyah. Alright? يعني اكتب غير العقيدة. Salat, fasting, marriage, divorce, prescribed punishments. We can take any hadith as long as it's authentic about the physical acts in the religion. But when it comes to belief, it has to be certainty. No hadith can be accepted unless it's mutawatir. This is what they said. And we can clearly see the effects of this in this book. Is this right? Is this wrong? Did the people of knowledge of the past speak about this before Ibn Hajar? Did the Salaf al-Salih talk about this? Did Imam Ahmed speak about this? That's not what we're saying. But we're proving and we're establishing what's meant by the book and what is the reason behind this. Ibn Hajar, rahimahullah, as if he makes a balanced opinion. Or before we get to that, because we have to mention the other argument now. And that is the people who say, first and foremost, this categorization is not from the people of the Sunnah. Secondly, the earliest Muslims, whenever there was a hadith that was authentically reported, no matter how many people were in the chain or not, as long as it met the standards and the criteria of acceptance, then we take it. Whether it's aqidah or whether it is ibadah or action. Now, we're going to stop here, and hopefully in the next lesson, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make it easy. We will we'll shed more light upon this. And it's very important, as we said so many times, the concept of understanding history when studying these different books. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala surely knows best. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.